On the morning of June 10th, 1912, a woman named Mary Peckham stood in her backyard in Villisca, Iowa, hanging laundry in the early sun. She glanced toward the Moore house next door. The shades were still drawn, every window sealed shut. No movement, no voices, no children running outside. It was well past 8 o'clock. Mary found that strange. Josiah Moore was a businessman, reliable, never late. His wife Sarah kept the house spotless, the children dressed and ready for school before dawn most mornings. Their routine was predictable. Their home was always open by sunrise. But that morning, the house was silent. Mary returned to her laundry. She told herself the family had simply slept in. It was summer. Maybe they were tired from the night before. They'd all attended a children's program at the Presbyterian church the previous evening. Perhaps they'd stayed out later than usual. But by noon, the shades were still down. Mary's unease deepened. She crossed the property line and knocked on the front door. No answer. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She walked around the side of the house, peering through gaps in the curtains. The rooms inside were dark. Furniture visible but motionless. No lamps lit. No sign of life. She called for Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who lived a few blocks away. Ross arrived quickly. He tried the doors. Locked. He circled the house. Every entrance sealed from the inside. He stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the front door, and then retrieved a spare key Sarah had given him months earlier. He unlocked the door. The first thing that hit him was the air. Thick. Stale. Wrong. Ross stepped into the parlor. The curtains were drawn tight. The room was dim, but he could see shapes. Furniture in place. Nothing disturbed. He moved toward the stairs leading to the second floor. He climbed halfway up and stopped. At the top of the stairs, in the guest bedroom to his right, he saw the edge of a bed. Two small figures lying motionless beneath a sheet. He could see dark stains soaking through the fabric. Ross did not go further. He turned, walked back down the stairs, left the house, and went directly to the town marshal.
Villisca was a small farming town in southwestern Iowa. Population just over 2,000. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Doors were left unlocked. Children played outside unsupervised until dark. Crime was rare. Violent crime was unheard of. Josiah Moore was 43 years old. He managed the John Deere farm equipment store in town. Well-liked, respected, a deacon at the church. He and his wife Sarah had 4 children: Herman, age 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5. On the evening of June 9th, the entire family attended the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church. It was an annual event. The children performed songs and recitations for the congregation. Afterward, the Moores invited 2 young girls to spend the night at their home: Lena Stillinger, age 12, and her sister Ina, age 8. The Stillinger girls were friends of the Moore children. Their parents gave permission. It was not unusual. Sleepovers were common in Villisca. The town felt safe. The group left the church around 9:30 p.m. Witnesses saw them walking home together. Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls. All of them in good spirits, laughing, normal. They reached the Moore house just before 10 p.m. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. By the time Ross Moore returned to the house with Marshal Hank Horton, a small crowd had begun to gather on the street. Word had spread quickly. Something was wrong at the Moore house. Horton entered first. Ross followed. Several townspeople waited outside, watching from the yard. Horton moved through the downstairs rooms slowly. The parlor was undisturbed. The kitchen showed no signs of struggle. Dishes from the previous day's breakfast still sat unwashed in the sink. A pan of uneaten food sat on the stove, cold. He climbed the stairs. The guest bedroom was to the right at the top of the landing. The door was open. Horton stepped inside. Two bodies lay in the bed. Lena and Ina Stillinger, both face up, both covered with a sheet pulled up to their chins. The sheet was soaked through with blood. The pillows beneath their heads were saturated. The walls near the bed were streaked with dark spray patterns. Horton moved to the next room. Josiah and Sarah Moore lay side by side in their bed. Same position, face up, sheet covering them, blood everywhere. The headboard behind them was shattered, pieces of wood embedded in the wall. Their faces were unrecognizable. He moved to the children's room. Herman and Catherine in one bed, Boyd and Paul in another. All four face down, all four covered, all four dead.
Horton returned downstairs and stepped onto the porch. The crowd had grown. He told them to stay back. He sent someone to call the county sheriff. Within an hour, investigators arrived from neighboring towns. A doctor was brought in to examine the bodies. A photographer documented the scene. Reporters began arriving by train from Des Moines and Omaha. By evening, the story had reached newspapers across the country. The details were immediate and brutal. All 8 victims had been killed with an axe. The weapon was found in the guest bedroom, leaning against the wall near the Stillinger girl's bed. It belonged to Josiah. He kept it in the barn for splitting wood. Each victim had been struck multiple times in the head while they slept. The blows were delivered with extreme force. Skulls fractured, faces destroyed. Blood pooled beneath every bed, soaking through the mattresses and dripping onto the floors below. But there were details that made no sense. Every mirror in the house had been covered with clothing. Towels draped over the bathroom mirror. A dress hung over the one in the master bedroom. Investigators couldn't explain it. A basin of water sat in the kitchen, blood-stained, as if someone had washed their hands. A slab of bacon sat on the floor in the parlor, unwrapped, next to a kerosene lamp. The lamp's chimney had been removed and placed carefully beside it. The axe used in the killings showed signs of deliberate handling. It had been wiped clean of most blood, though traces remained in the grooves of the wooden handle. And every door in the house had been locked from the inside.
The autopsies were conducted on June 11th. Dr. J. Clark Cooper, the local physician, worked alongside visiting specialists brought in from Omaha. They examined each body methodically, documenting every wound, every fracture, every point of impact. The findings were worse than anyone anticipated. Lena Stillinger, the 12-year-old, had been struck more than 30 times. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. Her face was nearly obliterated. The violence directed at her was disproportionate to the other victims. Investigators noted defensive wounds on her arms, faint bruising inconsistent with the axe blows. She may have been awake. Ina Stillinger, her younger sister, had been struck fewer times but with equal force. Both girls had been positioned carefully after death, their arms folded, their sheets pulled up evenly. Whoever killed them had taken time to arrange them. Josiah and Sarah Moore had each been struck at least 20 times. The headboard of their bed was splintered. Fragments of bone and brain matter were embedded in the wood. Blood had sprayed across the ceiling. The room looked like an abattoir. The 4 Moore children showed similar injuries: multiple blows to the head, blunt force trauma, no defensive wounds. They had died in their sleep. But the sequence of the killings troubled investigators. The murderer had moved through the house methodically. Josiah and Sarah were killed first, then the 4 children, then the Stillinger girls. The killer had worked in darkness. No lamps were lit during the murders. The curtains were already drawn when the family went to bed that night, so no one outside could have seen in. Whoever did this knew the layout of the house. And they had time. Estimates placed the murders between midnight and 5 a.m. That meant the killer spent hours inside the home after everyone was dead, washing, covering mirrors, moving through rooms, locking doors. The question no one could answer was simple: why? The investigation began immediately, but it was chaotic. Villisca had no experience with a crime of this scale. Marshal Horton had never worked a homicide. The county sheriff, John Jackson, was out of his depth. State investigators were called in, but jurisdiction became a problem. Local officials resented outside interference. Evidence was mishandled. The crime scene was contaminated within hours. Hundreds of townspeople walked through the house before it was properly secured. Neighbors, church members, curiosity seekers. They touched furniture, moved objects, tracked through blood. By the time professional investigators arrived, the scene was compromised. But even with the chaos, certain details stood out. A kerosene lamp had been found in each room where victims were killed. 4 lamps total. None of them lit, but all of them recently used. The wicks were trimmed. The chimneys showed residue. It appeared the killer had carried a lamp from room to room, extinguishing it before striking, then relighting it after to see what they had done. In the parlor, investigators found the slab of bacon and the chimneyless lamp sitting side by side. The bacon had been taken from the icebox. It was raw, uneaten. The lamp beside it had been wiped clean of fingerprints, though blood traces remained inside the base. Upstairs, in the room where Lena and Ina were killed, investigators found something else. The closet door in the guest bedroom had been left slightly open. Inside, on the floor, was a wet towel, blood-stained, folded neatly. Beside it, a bowl containing water and traces of blood. Someone had cleaned themselves in that room after killing the girls, and they had taken their time doing it. Theories emerged within days. The first suspect was a transient. Villisca was a railroad town. Freight trains passed through regularly. Drifters often camped near the tracks. Investigators focused on reports of strangers seen in town the day before the murders. One man stood out. Several witnesses reported seeing an unfamiliar man at the Children's Day program at the church. He had no children with him. He sat alone in the back. He left before the event ended. Descriptions were vague. Dark clothing, medium build, possibly carrying a small bag. Investigators searched hobo camps along the rail line. They found nothing. No physical evidence. No witnesses who could confirm the man's identity. The theory persisted anyway. It was easier to believe a stranger had done this. Someone passing through. Someone with no connection to the family. Someone who could disappear. But other details didn't fit that narrative. The house had been locked from the inside. Every door, every window latched shut. If the killer was a stranger, how did they get in? And more importantly, how did they leave? Investigators theorized the killer had hidden inside the house before the family returned from church. They could have entered through the unlocked back door earlier in the evening, concealed themselves in a closet or the attic, and waited. But that theory raised another question. How did they know the family would be gone that evening? And how did they know 2 additional children would be staying overnight? A second theory emerged, this one more uncomfortable. Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was a traveling Presbyterian minister who had been in Villisca the night of the murders. He attended the Children's Day program at the church. He was seen speaking briefly with members of the congregation afterward. He left town the following morning on an early train, hours before the bodies were discovered. On the surface, his presence seemed coincidental. He was a minister. Traveling ministers often visited small towns for church events. But there were inconsistencies in his behavior. Kelly had a history. He'd been dismissed from ministry positions in other towns, complaints about inappropriate behavior, strange sermons, allegations of obsessive conduct toward young girls in his congregations. Nothing criminal, nothing proven, but enough to make people uneasy. After the murders, Kelly became erratic. He inserted himself into the investigation. He wrote letters to authorities claiming he had information about the crime. He traveled back to Villisca multiple times unannounced. He attended the victims' funerals. He stood outside the Moore house staring at the windows. When questioned, his answers were vague. He claimed he'd been staying at a hotel in a nearby town the night of the murders, but he couldn't provide proof. The hotel had no record of him. He said he'd left Villisca early because he had another engagement, but he couldn't name where. Investigators pressed him. His story changed. He said he'd been in Villisca but had left before midnight. Then he said he'd been nearby but not in town. Then he stopped answering questions altogether. Kelly was arrested in 1917, 5 years after the murders. He was charged and tried twice. Both trials ended in hung juries. The evidence against him was circumstantial. His behavior was suspicious, but there was no physical proof linking him to the crime. He was never convicted. There was another suspect, one the town did not want to talk about: Frank Jones. Jones was a wealthy businessman in Villisca. He owned a farm equipment store, the same business Josiah Moore had once worked for. But Moore had left Jones's employment years earlier to start a competing business with John Deere. The split had been bitter. Jones felt betrayed. Moore had taken clients with him. The two men hadn't spoken in years. Jones had motive: financial rivalry, personal resentment. But there was more. Rumors circulated in town that Moore had been involved in an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. The rumors were never confirmed, but they were persistent. Some said Jones blamed Moore for damage to his family's reputation. Jones was questioned multiple times. He denied any involvement. He had an alibi. He claimed he was out of town the night of the murders, attending a business meeting in another county. His wife corroborated his story. But investigators found inconsistencies. Train records showed Jones had traveled through a town just 15 miles from Villisca the night of June 9th. He could have returned to Villisca, committed the murders, and left before morning. The timeline was tight, but possible. More troubling, investigators discovered Jones had hired a man named William Mansfield weeks before the murders. Mansfield was a drifter, a known criminal. He'd been arrested multiple times for burglary and assault. He worked odd jobs for Jones, mostly manual labor. But his employment ended abruptly just days before the killings. Mansfield disappeared immediately after the murders. He was located months later in another state. When questioned, he denied being in Villisca that night. He claimed he'd been traveling by rail, heading west. He had no witnesses, no proof. Mansfield was arrested and held for weeks. Investigators tried to connect him to physical evidence from the crime scene. They found nothing. No fingerprints, no clothing fibers, no witnesses who could place him in Villisca the night of June 9th. He was released. Jones was never charged. Mansfield was never charged. The theory that a wealthy man had hired someone to murder a rival family was never proven, but it didn't go away. The Moore house remained empty for months after the murders. No one would buy it, no one would live there. It stood at the edge of town, windows dark, doors locked, grass overgrown. Children avoided it. Adults crossed the street rather than walk past. Investigators returned multiple times. They re-examined the scene. They measured blood spatter. They tested theories about entry and exit points. They brought in experts from Chicago and Kansas City. Nothing new emerged. By 1913, the investigation had stalled. Leads dried up. Witnesses stopped coming forward. The case remained open, but no arrests were made. The town tried to move on, but certain details refused to fade. The covered mirrors haunted people. Investigators never understood why the killer had done it. Every mirror in the house draped with fabric, towels, dresses, sheets. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical. Some speculated the killer was superstitious. Old folklore claimed that mirrors could trap the souls of the dead. Covering them prevented spirits from lingering. But that explanation felt incomplete. This wasn't folklore. This was something else. Others believed the killer couldn't bear to see their own reflection, that the act of covering the mirrors was an attempt to avoid confronting what they had done, to remain invisible, even to themselves. But the most unsettling theory was simpler. The killer wasn't covering the mirrors to hide from the dead. They were covering them to hide from something living. The Stillinger girls troubled investigators most. Lena had been struck more times than anyone else in the house. The violence directed at her was excessive, personal. She had defensive wounds. She may have woken up. She may have seen the killer's face. Her nightgown had been disturbed, not removed, but shifted. Investigators noted this in their reports but did not elaborate. The implication was clear. The possibility was raised but never confirmed. Ina, the younger sister, showed no such signs. She had been killed quickly, efficiently, as if the killer had no particular interest in her. The question remained, why were the Stillinger girls even there that night? The sleepover had been spontaneous. Josiah and Sarah invited them after the church program. It wasn't planned in advance. No one outside the family knew the girls would be staying overnight. Unless someone saw them walk home together. unless someone followed them. By 1916, the case was effectively closed. Not officially, but practically. No new leads, no credible suspects. The investigation had consumed thousands of hours and produced nothing conclusive. Reverend Kelly remained the most likely suspect in the public's mind, but without evidence, he walked free. Frank Jones continued his business in Villisca, his reputation damaged, but his wealth intact. William Mansfield disappeared into obscurity. The Moore house was eventually sold at auction. A local family purchased it, renovated it, and tried to live there. They moved out within a year. They never explained why. The house changed hands several times over the decades. Each owner stayed briefly. Some reported hearing footsteps on the stairs at night. Others claimed doors would lock and unlock on their own. Most simply said the house felt wrong. In the 1990s, it was converted into a museum. Tourists can visit. They can walk through the rooms, see the beds where the victims were killed, stand in the parlor where the bacon and lamp were found. Some visitors stay overnight. They bring cameras, voice recorders. They hope to experience something. Most leave before morning. There were other deaths in Villisca that people stopped talking about. In 1904, 8 years before the Moore murders, a woman named Sarah Lockhead was found dead in her home. She had been struck in the head with a blunt object. The crime was never solved. In 1911, 1 year before the Moore murders, a family in the nearby town of Monmouth, Illinois, was killed in their sleep. 4 people. Axe wounds. No arrests. In 1912, just weeks after the Villisca murders, a family in Paola, Kansas was attacked at night. 5 people. Axe. 1 survived. They could not identify the attacker. In 1912 again, 3 months later, a family in Ellsworth, Kansas was killed in their beds. Same method, same brutality. The killer was never found. Investigators at the time noticed the pattern, but they couldn't connect the crimes. Different jurisdictions, different states, no forensic technology to link evidence, no centralized database to track suspects. But the similarities were impossible to ignore. All of the murders occurred in small Midwestern towns. All involved families killed in their sleep. All used an axe or blunt instrument found at the scene. All showed signs of the killer spending time in the house after the murders. Washing, arranging, lingering. The press called it the Midwest Axe Murder Spree. Law enforcement called it a coincidence. But families in small towns across Iowa, Kansas, Illinois, and Missouri started locking their doors at night. One man obsessed over the pattern. Detective James Wilkerson was a private investigator hired by the families of the Moore victims. He spent years tracking the cases. He traveled to every town where similar murders had occurred. He interviewed witnesses, collected police reports, built timelines. He came to believe all of the murders were connected, not just similar, but committed by the same person. Wilkerson developed a profile. The killer was likely male, physically strong, intelligent, methodical. Someone who could blend into small communities without drawing attention. Someone who traveled frequently. A salesman, a preacher, a laborer. Someone with reason to move between towns. He believed Reverend George Kelly fit the profile. Kelly had traveled extensively throughout the Midwest during the years the murders occurred. He had been in or near several of the towns where attacks took place. His behavior after the Villisca murders was erratic, obsessive. He inserted himself into the investigation. He wrote letters. He attended funerals. He couldn't stay away. Wilkerson tracked Kelly for years. He documented his movements. He spoke to people in towns Kelly had visited. He found complaints, disturbing behavior, incidents involving young girls. But he found no physical evidence. Kelly was never definitively placed at any of the crime scenes. No witnesses identified him. No forensic evidence linked him to the murders. Wilkerson's case against him was entirely circumstantial. Kelly died in 1954. He never confessed. He never admitted to being in Villisca the night of the murders. The pattern of axe killing stopped in 1912. The last piece of evidence found at the Moore house was never made public. It was discovered weeks after the murders, during a final walkthrough by investigators. Hidden in the attic behind a loose board, they found a small piece of paper. It was a note. Handwritten, brief, just a few words. The note was never entered into evidence. It was never photographed. It was never included in official reports. The investigator who found it removed it from the scene and kept it. He told only one other person about it before he died. His grandson found the note decades later among his grandfather's personal belongings. He shared the contents with a researcher working on a book about the murders. The note read, "Suffered the little children, nothing more." The handwriting did not match any known samples from the suspects. The paper itself was common, unremarkable. The phrase was biblical, referencing a passage about innocence and protection. But in the context of the crime, its meaning was inverted. The Moore children were not protected. The Stillinger girls were not spared. 8 people had been killed in their sleep, and someone had left a message in the attic. The researcher who learned about the note tried to verify it. They contacted the investigator's family. They searched archives. They found no record of it in official files. They published the information anyway. Some believe it was real. Others believe it was fabricated, a story added to an already incomprehensible crime. But the possibility that someone left a message, that they climbed into the attic after killing 8 people and wrote those words, is more disturbing than any other piece of evidence in the case. Because it means the killer wasn't just violent. They believed they were justified.
In 2004, a retired FBI profiler reviewed the Villisca case using modern investigative techniques. He analyzed crime scene photos, read autopsy reports, studied the timeline, applied behavioral analysis methods that didn't exist in 1912. His conclusions were unsettling. The killer had been inside the house for at least 3 hours after the murders, possibly longer. They had washed themselves multiple times, changed positions of objects, covered mirrors, arranged bodies, locked doors from the inside before exiting through a window. But the most significant finding was this: the killer likely knew the family. The level of violence directed at Josiah Moore suggested personal hatred. The disproportionate brutality toward Lena Stillinger indicated she was targeted specifically. The care taken to cover the children's bodies suggested guilt or remorse. This was not a random act. This was not a drifter passing through town. The profiler believed the killer was someone the Moores trusted, someone who had been inside their home before, someone who knew where they slept. He also believed the crime was not premeditated in the traditional sense. The killer had not planned to murder 8 people. They had planned to murder 1, possibly 2, but the situation escalated. More people were in the house than expected. The Stillinger girls were not supposed to be there, and once the killing started, it couldn't stop. The profiler concluded that the most likely suspects were Frank Jones or someone hired by him. But Jones had been dead for decades by that point. Mansfield was dead. Kelly was dead. Everyone who might have answered the question was gone. The Moore house still stands in Villisca. Tourists visit it. Paranormal enthusiasts spend nights there. Documentaries have been filmed inside. Books have been written. Podcasts recorded. The town itself has changed. Villisca is quieter now, smaller. Many of the buildings from 1912 are gone. The church where the Moores attended the Children's Day program still stands, but it's been renovated. The cemetery where the family is buried is maintained, but the graves are weathered. The house, though, remains almost exactly as it was the morning of June 10, 1912. The same layout, the same rooms, the same narrow staircase leading to the second floor. Visitors can walk through it, touch the walls, stand in the spots where the victims were killed. Some say they feel something in the house, a presence, a weight. Others say it's just an old building with a terrible history. But everyone who visits agrees on one thing: the house is quiet. Too quiet. The case has never been officially solved. No one was ever convicted. No confession was ever given. The physical evidence was mishandled and lost. Witness testimony was contradictory. Theories were pursued and abandoned. The most likely suspects are dead. The most credible evidence is gone. And yet, the question remains: who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger girls? Was it Reverend Kelly, a man disturbed enough to insert himself into the investigation and obsess over the crime for years? Was it William Mansfield, a drifter with a violent past and no alibi? Was it someone hired by Frank Jones, a man with motive, means, and a history of ruthlessness? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone whose name was never written down, someone who walked through Villisca unnoticed and left no trace. The answer is buried in the past, but the crime itself remains. 8 people were killed in their sleep in a small Iowa town on the night of June 9, 1912. They were struck in the head with an axe. Their faces were destroyed. Their bodies were arranged. Mirrors were covered. Doors were locked. And the person who did it walked away. They cleaned themselves. They hid evidence. They disappeared into the night or into plain sight, and they were never found. The Moore house is still there. You can visit it, walk through it, sleep in it if you want, but you will leave with the same question everyone else has. How does someone kill 8 people in a small town, in a locked house, and vanish without a trace? The answer is simple, and it's the reason the case still haunts people over a century later. They didn't vanish. They just stopped. And that might be the most disturbing part of all. Because whoever did this could have kept going. The pattern suggested they had before. The similarities to other murders across the Midwest were too precise to ignore. But after Villisca, the killings stopped. No more midnight attacks. No more families slaughtered in their beds. No more axes left at crime scenes. Either the killer died shortly after, was imprisoned for something unrelated, or made a conscious decision to stop. And if they stopped, that means they had control. They chose when to start, and they chose when to end. That's not the profile of a drifter or a madman. That's someone who decided 8 deaths were enough, and then went back to their life. The Villisca Axe murders remain unsolved. The house remains standing. The mirrors stayed covered for years. And somewhere in the silence between what happened and what was never answered, the truth is still waiting. But it's been waiting for over 100 years, and it will likely wait forever.